The Earl's Irresistible Challenge by Lara Temple. Chapter 1. Blood was thudding in Olivia's ears, loud in the echoing hollowness of St. Margaret's. She had purposely chosen an hour when there were likely to be few people in the church, but she hadn't expected it to be empty. Or dark. She should have realized they wouldn't waste many candles on a near-empty church on a rainy winter afternoon. The few tallow candles smoked sulkily in their sconces, and occasionally shivered in the draught that seemed to come from all directions at once. Surely if she cried out, someone would hear, wouldn't they? Hanstown might not be a fashionable part of London, but it was respectable. Or perhaps it was just best to tuck tail and run. Too late. The strike of boots on the flagstones matched the rhythm in her ears, and a man emerged from the darkness at the far end of the nave, his great coat rising about him like sweeping wings. She wasn't surprised they called him Sinful Sinclair. She presumed it was merely a play on his family name and less than pristine reputation. But as he moved towards her in a swift gliding motion, and she noted his pitch-black hair and the uncompromising features, she understood the name better. "Lord Sinclair, thank you for coming," she said as he stopped before her, pulling a piece of paper from his coat pocket. "Don't thank me. This isn't a social call. You sent this quaint little note?" "I did. Lord Sinclair, what do you want, and why the devil did you have to choose such an inconvenient location?" "It is convenient for me. Lord Sinclair, I didn't see another carriage in the lane outside. How did you arrive?" She blinked. She had not even begun, and already she was losing control of the situation. "What on earth does it matter? Lord Sinclair, It matters because I prefer to know what I am up against when I come to meet a silly little miss in an empty church in the middle of nowhere. If this is some kind of plan to entrap me, I should warn you, you have very much mistaken your prey." Olivia's confusion disappeared, and she couldn't hold back a laugh. "You believe I brought you here to entrap you? Goodness, you are vain." His eyes narrowed, and she felt a new flicker of alarm. Perhaps laughing at him was not advisable under the circumstances. "Lord Sinclair," she began again and hesitated. The clear list of points she wished to make faded under the oppressive force of his black eyes. She took another deep breath. "Lord Sinclair?" "I know my name," he said impatiently, "only too well. Stop wearing it thin and get to the blasted point." "I have some information about your father." The draught swirled his coat out in a wide arc about him and cut through the thin fabric of her own cloak, and she shivered. He didn't reply immediately, but the impatience was gone, replaced by a rather sardonic smile. "So do I, and very little of it is good. What of it?" "I have evidence that raises some questions about the circumstances of his death. It is possible that he was wronged." The only sound was the faint whistling of the wind through the cracks in the high windows. She pulled her cloak more tightly about her and waited. "Raise your veil." "Why?" "Because I prefer to see people's faces when they are lying to me." Olivia considered her options. She didn't know if involving this man was one of her more intelligent ideas, but he had come, and she would have to see this through. She rolled back the thick lace veil attached to her bonnet, and his dark eyes scanned her face without any change in their expression of amused contempt. "A little miss, but not silly, I think. Now let us begin anew. Why did you summon me here?" "I told you I have some information about the circumstances surrounding your father's death." "I see. And what do you want in exchange for this so-called information?" She hesitated. "That depends." "Not a very clever bargaining approach. You should have come with a clearer idea of what you think your lies are worth, or what you think I am worth." "But that is precisely what I am trying to determine." He laughed, a low, warm sound that did nothing to soothe her skittering nerves. "You want a list of my assets? You are by far the most inept blackmailer I have come across, sweetheart, and I have met a few." "I wasn't talking about your financial worth," she replied coldly. She knew he would be difficult, but she had not counted on him being annoying as well. She wasn't at all certain she wanted to deal with this man. "I can think of only one other level on which I might be of any worth," he continued, "but it is a bit cold here for that, however tempting the bait. I have a carriage waiting outside, though, if you would like." "No, I would not like," she said, unable to keep the annoyance out of her voice. Really, if only he would be quiet for a moment and let her think. She knew he was a care for nobody, but she had expected a little more interest in her story. Did he really not care at all? If he didn't, there was no point in continuing, except that she very much needed help. Mercer, her man of business, was a treasure, but he was only good when told precisely what to do, and she no longer knew which way to direct him. "Are you certain? You have a certain charm, and I wouldn't mind seeing just how far—" "Oh, would you please be quiet so I might think? I had no idea you would be so provoking." At least that wiped the mocking humor from his face. She waited for his anger, wishing she had held her tongue, but he merely took her elbow, turning her towards the exit. "Come with me." "No, let me go." Her confusion turned to panic, and she tugged her arm out of his grasp. He raised his hands and took a step back. "Calm down. I won't hurt you, but it's as cold as a witch's—" "It's freezing in here. I don't feel inclined to stand around in this draughty church discussing my family for any busybody to hear, while you make up your mind about extorting me. If you wish to speak with me, you may do so in the carriage. If not, good night." His words were calm, but his brisk stride as he headed towards the exit was a blatant dismissal. Olivia stared at his retreating figure with such a wave of hatred she could hardly believe it originated from her. The temptation to throw back her head and howl at the eaves was so powerful she could almost hear her own voice echoing back at her. Instead, she filled her lungs with cold air, lowered her veil, and stalked after Lord Sinclair. She reached the road and for one panicked moment thought she was too late. But then she saw the dark panelled carriage on the narrow lane leading past the church. The buildings hung low, blocking out what remained of the late afternoon gloom, and she could hardly see his face under the brim of his hat, but felt him watching her as she approached. Without a word, he opened the carriage door. She must be mad to be contemplating stepping into a carriage with one of the Sinful Sinclairs. Mad, desperate, or a fool. Well, she was desperate. And though she might be an utter fool, something about the way he mocked her at least relieved concern for her person. But still— "Lord Sinclair, perhaps we could—" He sighed and stepped into the carriage himself. She hadn't meant to grab the door as he closed it. She felt the resistance of his hold on the handle, then it eased but remained taut, counting out his patience. When he let go, she stifled her qualms and grabbed her skirts to take the high step into the carriage. Once inside, she pressed herself as far back into a corner as she could. He tossed a rug towards her. "I wish you would stop acting like a hissing cat being forced into a pond. Put that around you before you freeze. That cloak is about as useful in this weather as a handkerchief. Now you have 10 minutes to tell me your tale and be gone." She clasped her hands together and began her rehearsed speech. "My godfather, Henry Peyton, was found dead. The constable was summoned by a woman by the name of Marcia Pendle, who claimed she was Henry's mistress and that he died, well, while in bed. However, I know she isn't the genteel widow she claims to be, but a courtesan at an establishment on Cat Street, and that she was paid to make that claim to the constable at the inquest, and though I don't know why, I am at least certain she was not my godfather's mistress." "Are you? That is charmingly loyal of you, though naive. But how does any of this sordid but mundane tale relate to my father?" "Well, it doesn't, not directly, at least not as I can see yet. But amongst the belongings my godfather left at the leased house where he died were letters written to him by a Mr. Howard Sinclair from 20 years ago, and with them a note in Henry's hand which read, 'If this is true, Howard Sinclair was terribly wronged, and something must be done.' And underneath that he wrote the name Jasper Septimus and underscored it several times. I don't know if there's any connection between this note and his death and Marcia Pendle's lies. The letter appears to be mostly business correspondence, and I have no idea who Jasper Septimus is. I know this is all garbled, but I had to see if you could shed any light on his story." He listened with the same mocking calm with which he dismissed her earlier, as if he was watching a mediocre play, just titillating enough to overcome the urge to leave the theatre. With his arms crossed and his chin sunk into his cravat, to her exhausted mind it looked like an inverted white triangle of fur on her pet wolfhound's throat. Except that Twitch wasn't in the least frightening, despite his size and impressive fangs. Finally, Lord Sinclair spoke. "I grant you credit for a very vivid imagination. Let me see if I manage to follow this Drury Lane plot. Sorry, 2 interconnected Drury Lane plots. In the first, a doxy is paid by someone to lie to the magistrates about being your godfather's mistress, presumably to mask the circumstances of his death, which I gather were at the very least humiliating. In the second, your godfather ruminates over the past and comes to the startling conclusion, based on the words of a Jasper Septimus, whose name is an insult in itself, that my father was wronged. And this revelation is possibly at the root of the first tale. Have I done your fantasies credit?" It was evident he was a cold man, but she expected to hear something in his voice when he spoke of his father's death. There was nothing, not a quiver or a change of inflection. "I am not fabricating any of this. It is the truth." "Well, so what?" "So what?" she asked, shocked. "The facts you proffer don't amount to much, do they? Certainly not to a murderous plot that spans decades. A much more likely explanation is that you or this woman are attempting to extract money from me on the back of what you believe is my sentimental need to know more about my sire's very ignominious departure from this world. Let me assure you I have no such need. In fact, you might have gathered I am not of a sentimental disposition." "You are ignoring a further possibility, my lord." "Am I? Enlighten me. I admit to being curious what your rather unique mind will conjure next. You are a very peculiar girl, do you know?" "I am not a girl. I am almost 24 years of age." She immediately regretted her outburst as the amusement in his eyes deepened. He was baiting her, and she was rising to his hook each time. She should be the one in control of this conversation, yet she had let him take the reins from the moment he entered the church. She removed the rug, placing it on the seat beside her. "Good night, Lord Sinclair. I shall not waste any more of your time. You are clearly not interested in what I have to say." Again, that soft gliding motion of his was deceptive. Though she was closer to the carriage door, she had not even reached the handle when his hand was there. "Don't play me," he said softly. "I won't be led, and certainly not by a pert, almost 24-year-old who likes mysteries and hiding behind veils. You have 5 minutes remaining." "Then listen instead of being so aggravating. This is important to me, and you keep—" Her voice cracked, and she stopped before she crumbled completely. She was shaking from cold and weariness and the aftermath of tension and fear. She pulled the rug towards her and shoved her hands into its warmth, feeling like a pathetic fool. He didn't speak, just knocked against the carriage wall, and it drew forward. Olivia gasped and reached for the door again, but he put his arm out, barring it. "Calm down. I won't touch you, and I will take you wherever you ask once we are done. But though I don't care for much, I care for my horses, and I won't keep them standing further in this cold. Fair enough?" She nodded warily. "Good. Now what is your name?" he asked. "My godfather's name was Henry Peyton. I asked for your name, not his." "Olivia. Olivia Silverdale." "Olivia Silverdale. Sounds as fanciful as your tale. Now begin at the beginning. Who is this Marcia Pendle, and how did you trace her?" He had changed again, more businesslike, but no less ruthless. "I told you, Marcia Pendle works in a house of ill repute in Cat Street." "Cat Street. Madame Bernier's?" She raised her eyebrow contemptuously. Obviously he would know about the brothels of London. "I think that was the name. She calls herself Genevieve, but she is really Marcia Pendle from Norfolk." He shook his head briefly, but there was no negation there, only a kind of focused confusion as he watched her. Stripped of mocking or anger, he looked more human, but no less unsettling. "So, Marcia Pendle is Genevieve. How and why did you trace her, and why on earth would she tell you she was involved in your godfather's death?" "I traced her because I had my man of business hire a Bow Street runner, a Mr. Maguire. He was present at the inquest into my uncle's death. Apparently Marcia gave a masterful performance about a long-standing relationship where they would meet at the leased house where he died. When she left the inquest, he followed her, and after some discreet investigation, discovered her true identity and occupation. He also discovered she is very superstitious, and every week she visits a gypsy fortune-teller near Bishopsgate, who is no more gypsy than Marcia is French, but one Sue Davies from Cardiff. So I went to see Miss Davies. You went to Bishopsgate to visit a fortune-teller? Yes, and after we had a little conversation and understood one another tolerably well, I paid Gypsy Sue, as she is called, to tell Marcia she must consult an occultist. A what? He asked. The sardonic edge had left his voice completely. All she could detect there was a kind of fascinated shock. Have you never heard of them? Apparently they are quite popular of late. There is very much a demand for communication with dead loved ones on the other side. In any case, the gypsy, or rather Sue Davies, told me how Marcia was obsessed with someone named George, whom she loved and mourned, and that she had asked Sue— Wait 1 moment. Hell, never mind. I'll reserve my questions for the end. Thank you. So, I had my man of business lease a house in an unassuming part of town where such an occultist might credibly have her lodgings, and Sue Davies helped me set the stage, so to speak. Like Marcia Pendle, she was once an actress, and was very useful in procuring the correct clothes and artifacts. Then she sent Marcia Pendle to me, and under the guise of my occultist persona, I questioned her about the relations with Henry. Good Lord, a vivid imagination doesn't even begin to cover it. So we are now at a consultation between a masquerading occultist from Yorkshire, a French madam from Norfolk, and a fraudulent gypsy from Wales. Charming. Proceed. How did you know I was from Yorkshire? I have an ear for accents. Proceed. Very well. During this session, Marcia Pendle revealed she's never even met my uncle, let alone become his mistress. He held up his hand again. Revealed? A doxy and practiced blackmailer just handed you this information just for the asking? Well, not quite. I told you she is very superstitious. I told her the fellow she wanted to reach could not meet her in the afterworld unless she revealed all and cleansed her soul. You expose yourself to a woman who you believe might be involved in murder, and she believed a young girl is her gate to the afterlife. I don't know which of you is more unbalanced. Of course I didn't allow her to see me. I was heavily veiled, and I wore a rather vulgar dress Sue gave me, and she even showed me how to paint my face so that should my veil slip, I would not be recognizable. Sue did offer to act the occultist instead of me, but I had to be the one asking the questions. I could hardly prompt Sue all through the session, could I? I see, he said carefully. I was apparently right about your imagination. I'm impressed the powers that be have no issue with Marcia Pendle being a doxy, only with her lying to the authorities. Well, there are apparently different degrees of depravity. Oh, that is very true, there are. So back to your discoveries. I presume you asked her who paid her to engage her in this deceit? Well, of course. That was where I ran aground. She did divulge that his name was Eldridge, but she was so overset by her communications with George, she became quite hysterical with weeping, and I felt horrid and halted the session and told her George was being summoned back, but we could try again in a few days once her soul was calm. And she accepted that? Well, apparently George was never fond of crying females, so in fact it strengthened her belief in my powers. So you see, I need to find out who this Mr. Eldridge is, but Mr. Mercer has had no luck, and I don't know how to proceed. You surprise me. But before we continue to Mr. Eldridge, I'm curious why you are so certain she was not your godfather's mistress in the first place. I just knew, and I was right. An intuition, in fact. The sardonic inflection was back, and she shrugged. She had told him enough. It was time to see if he would be of any use at all, or whether he was merely enjoying treating her like some freakish fair exhibit. Will you help or not? Help with what? Help find out who this Eldridge is, and why he paid to defame my godfather, and whether it is in any way connected with Henry's suspicions about your father's death. Why? Why? She threw up her hands in disbelief. Because I, for one, will not sit by while someone out there is ruining people's lives. My godmother, Mrs. Peyton, is in shock and in pain, not only at the loss of one of the most wonderful men I've ever known, but at the discovery that he had betrayed her and his family. I must find out who is behind this and make them pay for what they have done to the Peytons, and I don't know how to do it on my own. That is why. Lucas stifled a sigh at her outburst. He wished he had tossed her note into the fire rather than succumbing to the siren's pull of curiosity. If he had an ounce of sense, he would send her on her way. She was probably either mad or a very creative liar, and he didn't have time to indulge in such nonsense. He was already running late for his meeting with his uncle at the War Office. But as his brother Chase had always told him, curiosity was likely to be his downfall, which was rather ironic because Chase was just as bad. For a moment he contemplated taking her into his uncle. Oswald would see through all the girlish dramatics and probably reveal her as the clever trickster she was, because although Oswald was as cursed with curiosity as any of the fated Sinclair tribe, he was never swayed by sentiment. Lucas usually wasn't either, but as much as it galled him to admit, even to himself, mentions of his father's demise still had the power to sink their talons into his flesh. He could stride over most matters without much compunction, but the moment she spoke those words he'd stumbled. Just a little, but enough. He couldn't walk away without at least trying to understand what was afoot, which meant he had to find out the nature of the peculiar beast sitting opposite him. Not today, though. However offended she appeared to be by his accusation of entrapment, her voice and demeanour were clearly those of a well-born young woman, and every moment spent in her company as night descended was a moment of precisely the kind of danger he did not enjoy. "Where do you live?" "Why?" "Because as tempting as the thought is, I can hardly leave you in the middle of London in the dark. I presume you do live somewhere. This might be a fantastical story, but you appear discouragingly corporeal." For the first time her eyes shifted away from him. She was about to lie, which was interesting in itself. "Spinner Street." "Spinner Street? Isn't that around the corner from the church where you summoned me?" "Yes." "Stranger and stranger. Is that sad neighbourhood populated by occultists now? At what number are you perpetrating your masquerade?" 15, but does this mean you won't help?" she demanded as he tapped the wall of the carriage and it slowed to a halt on the empty street, and a postilion jumped down to take his directions. "It means it is nearing your bedtime, Miss Silverdale. I will consider what you told me. That is all I can offer for now." Again her expression changed, or rather it leached away, leaving her face blank, just as they slowed and the gaslight filled the carriage. Now at least he could see what she looked like in repose. She reminded him of a painting he had once seen in Venice. It was a depiction of a biblical tale of Ruth, with Naomi seated on a stone cradling a very unattractive babe, and Ruth standing, her hand on the older woman's shoulder, and unusually for such a painting looking straight at the viewer. She, too, had worn no expression, but the message was clear. "Beware, I guard my own." "If this is a polite way of telling me you have no intention of pursuing this puzzle, I prefer you tell me so outright," she said as she raised the hood of her cloak over her bonnet. "Heaven forfend I waste any more of your precious time, which could be spent so much more profitably in gambling hells and brothels like Madame Bern." Her lecture ended on a squeak when he caught her wrist as she opened the carriage door. He should have kept his calm and sped her on her way. If he needed anything to convince him to have nothing more to do with her fantasies, it was a lecture. His temper had borne quite enough that evening. "I don't need you to put words in my mouth, and I sure as hell do not need your lectures. You do either again, and that will be the last you see of me, Miss Silverdale. I said I will think about it, and I will. That is all for now. Now run along before I decide to demand compensation for your ruining what had promised to be a very pleasant evening by fulfilling your worst suspicions about my character. Unless that is what you are looking for, is that tortuous little mind of yours curious about that as well?" He brushed his fingers lightly across her lips, as much to test his question as to warn her. They were soft and warm, and as they shifted under the pressure, his gaze caught on them as well, making the question rather more complicated than he had intended. But before he could pursue the thought, she drew away so abruptly she bumped into the frame of the door, and for the first time he saw real fear in her gaze, and something beyond it which surprised him. Revulsion was not the usual reaction to his overtures, but then he never made overtures to proper little virgins, and they never made appointments to meet him in a darkened church, and proceeded to tell him the world was made of cheese and rode along on the back of a turtle. He opened the door. "Run along, little miss." She didn't run. The blank watchdog expression returned, and she drew down her veil and jumped down limply from the carriage, ignoring the postilion who stood by to assist her.